Next panel is the world is watching. We have a number of different perspectives on the implications of everything that's happening from various parts of the world. And to moderate it is my friend and colleague from the George W. Bush Institute, Igor Khrestin, who is the Managing Director for Global Policy. Igor, thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for hosting us. A privilege to be on the panel with so many different distinguished colleagues here, bringing a variety of different perspectives. As David said, this is to take a broader view on what this war has meant to the world. And the title here is Defeating Putinism, and the world is watching. And unfortunately, a lot of the world did not take away the same conclusions from Russia's brutal invasion as the people here at this conference, we'll dive right into it and get a variety of different perspectives. Let me start first with Hiro Akita from Nikkei-Japan and ask how the Japanese have viewed this war from the Indo-Pacific, given their immediate neighbor, China. They've recently doubled their defense budget. I wonder why. And hopefully you can tell us. But what has the war shifted? How has the war shifted the thinking in the Indo-Pacific about the balance of power in the region, and what comes next? What is Xi Jinping thinking, basically? Yeah. Please tell us.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm from one of the most dangerous location in the world, surrounded by China and Russia and North Korea. And Russia has been occupying Japanese northern islands for about 80 years. And then all these three countries have a nuke, and then Japan is within the range of their nuclear missiles. So though it is a 25 hours flight from here to Tbilisi, but it is no way other countries, what is happening in Georgia and Ukraine, are no way other countries' problem for me. In that context, I just want to make two quick comments. One is a nightmare scenario from Tokyo perspective, and then second is about how to avoid that. So first, nightmare scenario from Tokyo perspective. I really believe that we must defeat Russia as quickly as possible in Ukraine, not only because it is crucial for Ukraine and Europe, but also it is important to avoid nightmare scenario. And that is a simultaneous war, major war, both in Europe and Asia. And maybe it may sound like a very, very unrealistic scenario by very pessimistic Japanese journalists, but when we look back the history, conflict in Europe spilled over to Asia, and that triggered the World War II. And in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, I think there are only a few people in the world to have predicted that Japan will attack Pearl Harbor 2 years later. So I think that what is happening in Europe and Asia affect each other. And when you look back, when you look at the Asian situation, tension in North Korean Peninsula, but also in the Taiwan Strait, is rising and rising in parallel with war in Ukraine. So I think that we should not underestimate the risk of simultaneous war, Europe and Asia. That is my first point. And if this happens, it will hugely benefit Putin, because West has to deal with war both in Europe and Asia. And as we know, US already abandoned its defense strategy to maintain the military capability to fight the two major wars at the same time. It was 10 years ago. So we have to avoid that. Then second is, what should we do to avoid such a nightmare scenario? So namely, it is the Third World War. That is, I think it is possible, and that we should at least do two things. One is to, again, naturally, we have to defeat Russia as quickly as possible in Ukraine. But in order to do that, we have to also pressure China more to stop its economic and political support to Russia, and also potentially prevent China from providing military assistance. They are now providing dual material, supplying dual materials like drones. And conversely, China never want Russia to badly get defeated in Ukraine, because this will mean that, of course, China doesn't want Russia to use nuke, but they don't want Russia to get defeated, because if it happens, this means that China will lose only great power partnership to counter against the West. So it is like a replay of December 1991, when Soviet Union ceased to exist. And then China was the only communist major power and largely isolated. So I think we should pressure China. And then lastly, we also have to deter China more effectively while we will enhance military support to Ukraine. And I think it's possible because China will not be able to launch full-scale military operation unless China is 120% sure that they can win. And if they will lose, Communist Party will lose power. So if US and US allies, especially Asian allies, would join together and further enhance its military capability in Asia, then so that we can complicate Xi Jinping's calculation, and so that we can keep Xi Jinping to hesitate to make a decision to go to the war in Taiwan, then I think we can prevent two major war. Yeah, I wanted to touch upon about the global south, but maybe I'll leave it.
We'll come back to a lot of those. Thank you, Hiro, a lot of those points, and there's a lot to unpack there about both the Taiwan contingency and how it impacts strategic thinking in the United States as well about supporting Ukraine. But now, I want to turn to Anya Borshchevskaya, and I'll call you Anya to distinguish from the other Anya, but who is a Near East expert. She's from the Washington Institute. And a lot of we talk, of course, about the aggression against Georgia in 2008 against Ukraine. We haven't talked a lot about Syria and the Russian actions there and how they impacted, the decision to go into Ukraine, how they impact Putin's strategic calculus. And Anya has written a terrific book about this. So Anya, take it away, please. But also, the Middle East perspective here is vitally important. Putin obviously just came back from Turkey, having not agreed to extend the grain deal, and obviously other players like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been really important as well. So maybe you can unpack some of that for us. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Igor, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'll start with Syria since that's how you posed the question. When we think about the global perspective, which is what the purpose of this panel is, in terms of what brings us to this day in Ukraine, we need to look at the big picture, starting with Georgia, Ukraine in 2014. The next intervention that Putin had was in Syria in 2015. With each successive intervention that Putin had over the years, there's a Russian expression, appetite comes with eating, and each of these interventions was bigger in scale. Putin had never paid a price for these interventions. With Syria in particular, the big mistake that Western policymakers had made is thinking that Russia will overextend itself. President Obama at the time famously said that Russia will find itself in a quagmire in Syria, and it will create another scenario similar to the one that the Soviet Union had in Afghanistan, forcing Russia to overextend its resources and ultimately bring down Russia, just as the Soviet Union had, according to some views, had collapsed in part due to its misadventure in Afghanistan. The Syria intervention, however, was designed precisely to avoid another quagmire. and instead in fact, it incorporated a number of lessons learned from the Soviet failure of Afghanistan. Instead, it helped Russia establish a permanent military position on the Eastern Mediterranean, which helped Russia's invasion of Ukraine several years down the road. So when we look at the world from the Russian state perspective, there is more of a continuity rather than a disconnect between Europe and the Middle East. They're both part of the same theater. And this is true of Vladimir Putin, but it's also true of Russian rulers that came before him, and will probably be true of anyone who takes Putin's seat in the Kremlin after. In other words, the so-called South, the so-called vulnerable South underbelly, has always been a priority for the Russian state, and it was always the connection between Europe and the Middle East was very strong. And that will probably be my one big takeaway. In fact, if we look at what's happening in Syria right now, despite Russia's military losses in Ukraine, Russia is escalated in Syria. There have been months and months of Russia's harassing American drones in Syria. This escalation has cost Russia nothing, and it happened after Russia harassed Russia's American aircraft in the Black Sea, which also went undeterred. So there's continuity between Russia's military activities in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, to turn to your other question, Igor, and that has to do with the rest of the Middle East, what we observed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the Middle East is, at best, overall, the region reacted with ambivalence. The region did not want to isolate Russia. The region condemned Russia rhetorically, perhaps, at the UN, but ultimately it stopped short of blaming Russia directly. In other words, naming Russia as an aggressor. Rather, it took a much more nuanced, it engaged in sort of this diplomatic ballet, if you will, of linguistics and how it wanted to portray the war. Ultimately, the region doesn't really understand the history between Russia and Ukraine, and it buys into the Russian narrative on Ukraine, but also on the West and on NATO, which ultimately translates into practical support for Russia. And that brings us to the UAE, to Saudi Arabia, to Turkey. Why is it important to buy into a narrative? Buying into a narrative translates into particular action. And what we've seen over the course of the year is that, if anything, Russia has engaged more with this region. Russia's trade with this region has increased. And that specifically, UAE stands out in this regard, and interestingly enough, Turkey. Saudi Arabia did not want to change oil output, which contributed to Russia's ability to finance its war in Ukraine. So again, buying into narratives is important, not for its own sake, but because it translates into practical steps on the ground. And from a practical perspective, the Middle East has been helpful, has provided a helpful avenue in helping Russia finance the war in Ukraine. Ironically, one would think that countries like Egypt, who are suffering from Russia withdrawing from the Black Sea grain deal, as you mentioned, Igor, earlier, are refusing to condemn Russia. And they've issued some rhetorical statements, but in practice, Russia continues to construct Egypt's nuclear power plant. There is a trade relationship that is ongoing. And again, from beyond the rhetoric, there's more continuity and more cooperation with Russia. And we can talk a little bit more about the reasons why, but this is the reality, that the Middle East remains an important arena where Russia is able to forge relationships that help it finance the war. And when it comes to American adversaries, and that is Iran and Syria, again, you're seeing more of a strengthening of a relationship on a strategic level. In fact, it is and this will be my last point, it is no coincidence that when Zelensky came to Washington last December and spoke to U.S. Congress, he named a Middle East country as the only country that stood out in his speech. Other than talking about the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, he talked about Iran. And that is because Iranian drones have helped Russia degrade Ukrainian infrastructure and, again, make Russia make practical military gains on the ground. And I will end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, thank you. And this, this actually could be a great segue point about U.S. leverage in the region to work with those players because they're important to Russian thinking. And I know the Ukrainians certainly have tried with the Saudis and pushing the peace initiative and engaging China as well, which is a double-edged sword because of the Chinese position. But maybe Keith Brown from Arizona State, I can get your perspective on the U.S. strategy to manage, to use its leverage in this war, and also U.S. grand strategy of trying to, mitigate the concerns of potentially confronting China at some point, and how they view the prism, how people in Washington and Arizona, the Arizona perspective, view the conflict from that lens.
Sure. Thank you. Is this working?
I think so.
Is this working now? Yeah, hi.
So, yeah.
So again, as everyone's saying, very pleased to be here. My perspective, my training is in anthropology, so although I head a center of Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies, I'm always coming not so much from the grand strategy side as like, well, what does it look like on the ground in different places? And the two places on the ground that I feel I'm here to represent. One is the Western Balkans writ large, and the other is a little bit about what's going on in the southwestern United States, where arguably Putinism is alive and well in ways that when we look from very far above, we don't necessarily see. So those are the two things I want to talk about. And because I'm an anthropologist, I shamelessly borrow or learn from what I hear from other people. I love that you started by saying that there are lenses, there are different perspectives. History shapes how people see this current conflict. And I wanted just three of the lenses that I heard that I think are really useful for us. One, various people have said this, but Viola von Kramon stressed it in particular, the importance of storytelling to broader audiences, to publics, to kind of consolidate public understandings of and what is at stake. Then the second came from the audience yesterday. Anna Dolidze asked about decolonization and what the work of decolonization, which is something that the academic world, in theory, can play a lead on because it's our bread and butter to some degree in the critical social sciences. And then the third was Igor Munteanu's invocation of radical solidarity as a necessary mobilizing construct through which to maintain a unified approach. And I find all of those perspectives really helpful because they remind us that it doesn't really, it does matter what the signaling is from the United States, when the United States is quite effective at explaining its interests around the world, but unless that resonates and unless there's some recognition on the part of US leaders that people bring different histories to how they see these conflicts, it's unlikely for that message to land, in contrast to how successfully some parts of the Russian message land. And so that's my last point about the Western Balkans, the fourth concept I would add is the importance of cultural knowledge and cultural understanding. And the two aspects that I hope I can talk about later, one is the long-standing method of warfare and engagement, which many scholars have pointed to as a Russian trademark of reflexive control, provide a stimulus to make someone do something. They think they're doing it for their own interests, but in fact they're serving yours. And the second concept is this concept that comes out of Vadim Volkov's book. That's the first place I found it, Violent Entrepreneurs, talking about the Russian crime scene in the 1990s. This concept of bespredel, without restraint, is how you get, if you can create a world where there are no restraints, you can get what you aspire to. And there's a scholar based in Finland, Sergei Prozorov, who has used this concept after Georgia in 2008 to argue that what that marked was the moment where Putin took this concept global from the domestic. So that's the sort of frame that I hope I can talk to at various points. But just very quickly on the Western Balkans, I just flag that the Russian messaging. So there are just multiple lenses. So I'm not able to say there's a Western Balkan perspective, right? And in particular, I think it's very interesting when one reads the opinion polls of various kinds of since the invasion of Ukraine, to see the split between those parts of the wider community who are clearly reading and consuming Russian narratives, and those that are not being subjected to that or are not absorbing it. And in particular, the Republic of Macedonia, that I know best, you can see a real split between Albanian-speaking population who are maintaining a very much European-facing, NATO-facing stance, and the Orthodox, Slavic, Christian majority Macedonians who are, I think, consuming more of those narratives, and they're landing with them. And I think in particular, we've talked a lot about original sins or origin points. The Western Balkans demands our attention because I think the place that NATO's air war over Kosovo in defense of human rights against Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia is still a rhetorical point that where President Putin and Russia have crafted a simple narrative that still lands with people, partly because they've been repeating that same narrative for 20 years, and the alternative narratives of what was going on have been allowed to fall into disuse. And I think some parts of the U.S. foreign policy establishment discount things that happened 25 years ago in a way that people in Macedonia, in Serbia, in Kosovo do not.
Well, thank you. Maybe I can pick up on that with Anna Kuchenbacker with the European Center for Foreign Relations and talk about sort of these narratives and how they've changed since the war. We obviously have seen a lot of discussion here about these sort of center of gravity strategics shifting from Paris and Berlin to the eastern capitals we've had distinguished representative here make the connection between the authoritarian threat writ large. So not just Russia and the Russian sort of threat, but also China, and how have those narratives changed since the war, and how has that changed the strategic culture and thinking inside of perhaps Berlin or inside of German politics, however you wanted to sort of take that. Thanks.
Sure, thank you, Igor. Happy to be here. And I guess when it comes to Germany, of course, German Zeitenwende is crucial. Zeitenwende is a German word that made it very quickly into the English universe, and it basically means that there is a tectonic, epochal shift. And this is what Chancellor Scholz laid out in his speech that he gave 3 days after the full invasion of Russia of Ukraine. And that basically consists of 3 elements. One is that he pledged to kind of revitalize German military and put a special funds of 100 billion towards that, to invest that, then to get Germany of its heavy dependency, that was 67%, so really, really high, to get Germany of the energy dependency, and then to engage in sanctions, but also, more importantly, to reverse Germany's decade-long policy on not delivering weapons into conflict zones. So these were the 3 more practical elements, but I think when we're talking about narratives and beliefs, and I think this is also ties into the discussion that we had between Western Europe and Eastern Europeans. So the full invasion challenged and overthrew, I would say, major core German foreign policy beliefs. One major belief is that security in Europe is only possible with Russia. And the second one is the more countries are interconnected, the less there is a chance of conflict and war. And I think this maybe also explains a little bit what has been discussed in previous panels, so that this is now the moment has come for Germany to kind of rewrite what happened between 99 and 22. So in the German view, and this has of course been shaped by the German reunification, the relatively peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union. So this belief, like the end of history, so we are all marching now in the same direction, we are on the way of, these countries are on the way to democracy, and Russia's behavior for a long time was interpreted they are on the way of democracy, but of course there are setbacks. Right. So, and because this happens, and for a long time, there were these excuses that we have to help Russia more to get it right. And this, of course, and I think this also explains that, you know, to reverse this assessment, this explains also maybe why Chancellor Scholz, why Zeitenwende happened for in the German mind in 2022 and not in 2014 and not in 2008. So, but I think there is now a lot of discussion going on, a lot of revisiting. But as I said, since these beliefs are deeply set and enshrined in the German belief system. So this takes time, and you know, just as an explanation, I think you measure progress from the starting point. Of course, we are not there yet. There is a lot more to think about and to discuss. But I would argue that when you look where we started, that we made progress.
No, that's wonderful, and you know, you reminded me that in one of his drunken tweets, Dmitry Medvedev said he still believes in the Vladivostok to Lisbon, European, but under, of course, Russian control. So you know what Russians think about common united Europe, and I think a lot of people forget how much the West did to help Russia and in what sorry state it was, and how much we have debates in the United States about assistance to Ukraine. People forget how much assistance we gave to the Russian Federation when it collapsed, and the amount of resources that were spent to help to help Russia, and we ended up there. But maybe we can come back to some of these points. But maybe here I'd like to go back to you about sort of the Indo-Pacific and the Russia-China strategic partnership. And I think this is, my view is that it's very much from Beijing perspective now a junior partnership because of Russia's increasing dependence on China from everything to semiconductors and other goods and the economic dependence, but also strategically. And we saw a very good example of this with the new map that China had helpfully put out that included claims from India, but also a claim of Russian territory that Russia considers its sovereign territory. How does this play out in the Indo-Pacific? How does that impact Japan? How does the war change that? Does it change that narrative?
Thank you for your question. I think we should pay more attention to the risk of the deepening strategic cooperation between Moscow and Beijing because of two reasons. There is a more bilateral cooperation going on. Recently, Russia allowed China to use the port of Vladivostok in June this year as an almost de facto domestic port of China. And Russia didn't oppose for Xi Jinping to hold the first Central Asia and China's leaders meeting. So China is exploiting a lot in return for China's support, economic support, and also political support and potentially military support. Again, China is now providing dual-use product. So that is one thing. But the more serious consequence could be caused by that China and Russia's strategic cooperation to isolate West. Yeah, in this, here we are united, but actually, unfortunately, if we step back, West is being isolated to some extent. According to Economist Intelligence Unit recent survey, demographically, only 1/3 of population in the world support Russia, sanction against Russia or leaning toward West. And 1/3 support Russia or leaning toward Russia. And 1/3 is in between. So China and Russia, especially China, is trying to, China took power by surrounding Kuomintang in 1940s, by surrounding them from the rural area and city. And then they took power. So China is trying, together with Russia, trying to surround West from rural area or countryside. That is a global south. So specifically, China and Russia pushed very hard at the BRICS summit to expand the membership, though reportedly China or Brazil, democratic countries, are relatively cautious to expand, but China pushed it. And so I think it is very important for the West to offset or push back, not only against Russia in Ukraine, but also in global south. And in order to do that, I think, global south I traveled to Rwanda June this year, and global south people said that they worry about China, excessive debt, exploitation, but that after all, China drops a lot of money without preaching. But the West comes to Africa. Actually, West doesn't come to Africa, but when it comes, the West preach and then do not drop as huge money as China drops. So we have to change, we have to adopt a more effective approach to find the mutual beneficial cooperation with the West. Yeah, if I go into detail, it takes a long time, so I'll stop here.
Oh, sure. Well, we potentially can come back to that. And one of the things sort of about the Chinese position is that it's also emerged as a player in the Middle East now, and facilitated this agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians. How do you see those dynamics playing out, with what's happened in Ukraine? But also, here you mentioned an important point on sanctions, and a lot of the sanctions evasions now takes place in the Middle East. Dubai is the biggest transshipment point for Russian goods. All the Russians that used to come to the European capitals are now parked with their assets in Dubai and their yachts. But maybe you can unpack some of that and take that in the direction of how you see this China, Russia, U.S. Sort of rivalry playing out, and what the Middle Eastern players, how they're looking at that.
Sure. Well, let me pick up on a point that Hiro has made just now about the West becoming isolated, because I think we can really see this dynamic playing out in the Middle East. And what I mean by that is, first, ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we in the West had our own narrative that Russia is isolated and that Russia is losing the war. But the fact of the matter is, what we're seeing very clearly, what we've been seeing for a long time now, is that Russia was only isolated by the liberal free world. Russia is not isolated globally, and the reason why we're having this discussion right now is precisely because of the point that here you just made about the global south. I would say until we change our approach to the global south, Russia will not be losing this war in the way we'd like to see it lose this war. The way this dynamic is playing out in the Middle East is in the following way. The Middle East does not want to have to choose its trajectory of foreign policy between the United States, Russia, or China. It wants to have a diversified foreign policy. And it is, and some of our partners are more assertive. They want to be treated more as equal partners rather than junior partners. And that, in part, translates into this triangulation of relationships that we see playing out. What I had mentioned earlier about the Middle East buying into Russian narratives on the West.
You can hear those
in Ukraine,
narratives back
yes.
there. That's the Russian narrative.
Exactly.
Over there. A lot of loud barking.
It stopped.
Yeah, there you go.
Stopped,
See,
yes.
No, it
there it is.
continues.
So.
Continues. Is that ultimately there's a deeper frustration with the United States. And this frustration with the United States, misperceptions, I would say, of the United States, continues. It translates into how the Middle East relates to Russia and China, and how Russia and China continue to vie for influence and access in this region. So let me make this one last point. We in the United States, in our national security strategy, have named Russia and China as our top competitors. But we have yet to devise a global strategy on how to tackle either one of them. Also, we have been unable to tackle both at the same time. And a mark of a truly great power is one that is able to focus on more than one priority at the same time. We have yet to reach that state. But both Russia and China are looking at this from a global perspective. So whereas we see the great power competition unfolding in Europe when it comes to Ukraine and Taiwan when it comes to China, both Russia and China are looking at the global picture. Ukraine, and this will be my last point, to its credit, has recognized that they have a problem of this failure of the global South to understand their narratives. That's why we're seeing Ukraine trying to open more embassies in Africa, for example, and somewhat more in the Middle East. So there is, I'm happy to see that the Ukrainian government has recognized this gap. But the West needs to do more in understanding, first of all, articulating a clear strategy, and second, looking at this war from a global perspective rather than just stating that Russia is losing, whereas it's only losing in the liberal free world.
No, those are excellent points. Keith, maybe we can come back to sort of narratives that you mentioned. Again, going back to our interruption here. The Russian narrative seems to be anything that sticks, anything anti-Western that sticks. Just throw it on the wall. Some of it's very crude messaging, which is, remind the West and the sub-Saharan African of Western crimes. Show the pictures of the Belgian Congo and the horrible things that Western imperialism, and this is the old sort of Soviet playbook. And we've tried to be, sort of obviously counter that with a very loud liberal democratic sort of voice and saying this is about freedom, this is about democracy, and that hasn't always, to Anna's point, struck a chord. So how do we manage that problem, and how to maybe the Western Balkans is a good example of the Serbia sort of obviously being a very traditionally pro-Russian state, but also having aspirations to join the European Union, and other things have to manage that. So maybe you can cover a little bit of that, and then we could move to questions. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to pick up on something Hiro said. Just this challenge of not preaching, right? So that's sort of what I was suggesting with these two ideas of harnessing the power of decolonization and unleashing the power of radical solidarity. So right now we're seeing in the Balkans, as you said, that in some sense, the Russian narrative, to my mind, the Russian narrative is all about spoiling rather than building, right? It's about ensuring that disorder, confusion, multiple narratives persist. And so right now Bulgaria is leveraging its position as an EU member to hold the Republic of North Macedonia hostage over certain interpretations of history. We've just recently seen the Kosovo leadership trying to take advantage of this moment of ambivalence towards Serbia's contested role to extend influence in North Kosovo, right? So these are both cases where leaders have looked at the situation and pursued their own narrow national interests, taking advantage of the disorder, without any clear awareness that they are serving a Russian goal by doing so. And so, first thing, one thing that I'm super humbled by here in Georgia is the way in which the Georgians who are here are making it clear. We're not making comparisons between what's happening now. We're not saying I told you so in 2008. Let's all get this solved together, right? So that move of radical solidarity that is expressed by us being here is really inspiring. And then the second piece about your Arizona question, I think, is I feel like the work that I want to go away from here doing is examining whether I am being a useful idiot in the old Soviet agent mode, right? Whether the questions that I ask are ultimately undermining goals that I have and ideals that I have. And so I'll just finish. The reason I flagged Arizona at the end there is the mayor of Phoenix, the Phoenix City Council, recently voted and decided to send 500, 600 unclaimed firearms that the Phoenix Police Department have confiscated. They voted to send them to a Ukrainian police department. And 2 legislators in Arizona are now questioning this, are blocking whether this is legal, are asking the Attorney General to investigate this and potentially penalize the city of Phoenix as breaking Arizona law and therefore cutting off state revenue to the city of Phoenix because of this action. Now, on one level, these legislators, I'm sure, imagine that they are enforcing the rule of law as they understand it, and in another level, they are clearly serving a goal that is out of line with what U.S. national policy has clearly emerged as after things have changed and the Russian invasion has made clear what the stakes are. The last thing I'll say, sorry, I just want to put it out there that no one has ever referred to Samuel Huntington as a useful idiot, and his model of what happened after the 1990s, this notion of the clash of civilization, this notion of kin states, this notion of bandwagoning among states belonging in particular spheres of influence, has been enormously influential, is dubbed as realism, and in his defense was coined as an interpretation of the world before Russia ceased to be a state. Before it ceased to be a state and became a criminal enterprise.
Well, thank you. Maybe for next year we'll have like a Francis Fukuyama versus Mearsheimer cage fight situation going on here about Huntington is lecture. Yeah, that's right. But maybe, Anna, I can ask you for just 1 minute. I know we're just to wrap everything up. We're in Europe. This is a war, major war in Europe. The United States stands with Ukraine, with Europe, but how do we bring the rest of the world along? How do we make this problem a global problem? How do we advance our narrative successfully with the framing that works in other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to add one thing. I think it's really important to also mention how the corona pandemic prepared the grounds for conspiracy theories. And what you have in European countries, but I think also in the US, that those outlets who spread the anti-vaccine, the conspiracy around the vaccines, planting chips into people's body, replacement theories, those outlets are mostly those who now spill the Russian narratives, and through this reach a really wide audience in Europe and the United States. What I want to pick up on what has been said before, so I think what we have to come to is to have a clearer vision of how we want this war to end, and what is a success for Ukraine, but also for the Western allies. And my sense is that there is this notion, we cannot come up with a strategy, we have to know how the war ends, whereas I think we know that we will, in the long run, will have to deal with a revanchist Russia. If Russia loses, it will want revenge, and if it wins, it will want more. So I think this is pretty clear, and this is something that you can you can plan on, you can prepare for. I think then, of course, it's very important to stay united, and I think this is really impressive how so far the Europeans have managed to do that. The challenge here is really to kind of to bring together Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans with their different perceptions and stay united. I think what looms large is the US presidential election. So I think Europe is very aware that without the leadership of President Biden, we wouldn't be where we are today. But I think there is a lot of fear and concern how things may change if Donald Trump is going to be elected. And I think it's important to plan for that and not to try to hope for the best.
Donald Trump, someone like that could never be elected in the U.S. Well, thank you. On that encouraging note, we'll move to questions. A couple of notes. A, please remember you're standing between the audience and lunch, so keep your questions very short. Second note, as one of my bosses in Congress used to say, if you want to give a speech, you have to run for office. So please ask a question. Though some of you may be running for office, but I don't know. But let's start. Let's start the gentleman there. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Gianodia. As we all understand, I think Russia is not isolated. And more than half of the world either supports Russia or sort of reserves its judgment, so to say. And I'm afraid to say that my country, as represented by its government, is in this second larger part of the world. So my question is, it's a bad thing, yeah, and but it's a bad thing, but you know, Ukraine, with the support of the West, should still win this war, and we hope that it will, even though that big situation is not going to change, that India or China is not going to join the West in anti-Russian coalition, right? So my question is, how exactly this hampers the effort of the West and Ukraine to defeat Russia? Is it that this lack of solidarity it helps Russia to reduce the results of sanctions, the effects of sanctions, or is it that it will get military aid? So it's more specifically military economic support that undermines Western efforts to isolate Russia, or it also hampers this pro-European coalition, pro-European and pro-Ukrainian coalition, in the sense that Western strategists, decision makers, think that yes, we have to defeat Russia, it's important, but we also should not alienate India. We should think how to deal with China, and so this somehow makes things too complicated and prevents the West from focusing enough on helping Ukraine.
Okay, thank you.
If I understood your question correctly, the way I'd answer it is first, the West does not have a clear vision. This is to Anna's point about vision of what a Ukrainian victory would look like. We don't have a clearly articulated vision of what a Ukrainian victory would look like. I think that's the first issue. And the second is that our lack of understanding of just how much the support of the global South would help Russia continue to stay afloat and finance the war, I think contributed to our potential miscalculation of what it would take to see Ukraine win and Russia lose. Because it's not so much that the West does not want to isolate India. It is simply that the West has been unable to convince India to, for example, stop purchasing Russian weaponry, because India is dependent on Russian weaponry. Similarly, the West has been unable to stop to make Saudi Arabia change its oil output. And oil prices, high oil prices, have been an important contributing factor to why Russia has been able to continue to finance its war. The fact that, to give you another example, Russia has been able to find alternative trade routes together with Iran, together with China and the Gulf states, in helping, which helps Russia circumvent sanctions. And therefore, at least at year's end, the effect on of sanctions on Russia's economy has not been as detrimental as some had predicted. Whereas Ukrainian economy, for example, has contracted by 30%. Ukrainian GDP has contracted by 30%. And one last example, Russia's exports of wheat and fertilizer have increased in the last year, whereas Ukrainian exports have declined. So there's a number of, if you look across the globe, there are a number of practical examples that show how Western failure to convince the global South that Russia's alternative vision is a losing one, is contributing to Russia's ability to form these relationships and find ways to stay afloat financially, militarily, politically, what have you, and continue its war. And as my co-panelists have mentioned, this is very dangerous because of what that would mean in the long run. It would mean that Russia would simply have a pause, would potentially seek revenge.
Let me ask Hiro a comment as well.
Oh, yes. Just quickly, if I add, first of all, it is very important to, again, defeat Russia as quickly as possible, badly as possible. So no global South country wants to align with the loser, so it is a precondition. But in addition to that, I think that the global South will separate into three categories: pro-anti-West, like Iran, and potentially current South African regime, relatively anti-West, and pro-West, such as potentially pro-West, like India and maybe Indonesia, and the in-between. So it is very important to reach out to a third camp, relatively pro-leaning West camp first, and then, so specifically India and Indonesia, and hopefully Brazil. Current administration is relatively, anti-West, but Brazil, those countries, and then through them try to reach out to other part of global South. In that sense, from tomorrow or this week, India will host G20 summit, and it is a very important experiment for G7 about how we can collaborate with pro-West global South to bridge between West and global South.
Thank you. We'll take one more question before we go to lunch. Back there, white shirt.
Why has the narrative that Ukraine has tried to push that this is an anti-colonial struggle not resonated with the global South?
This is for me.
If you like, I mean, just about sort of.
Well, I feel like narratives that are advanced by recently imperial powers are less convincing than narratives that are owned and shared by formerly colonized or countries that have been on the wrong side of power. And I feel, it's partly an answer to the first question as well, I feel like the kind of coalition in which Central and East Europe, with their experiences, is now getting purchase in the European and the US context, is something that could be, it's a move that could potentially happen elsewhere in the world as well. And your dividing line between the blocks, I think, shows that, right? The powers that have been have been on different sides of colonization and imperialism.
Anna, would you like to comment? No. Okay, well, I think with that, we'll wrap up. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for these perspectives, and off to lunch we go.
Great, and Igor, thank you very much for a great job of moderating panel. Thank you.